Good evening. I'm James Roth, Deputy Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of my colleague Stephen Rothstein, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, thank you for coming this evening. I also want to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters at the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. I'm also delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online, including those of you watching from the John F. Kennedy Hyannis Museum. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening, and when Q&A starts, we invite those of you who are joining us in person tonight to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. There's one over here and one over here. Tonight's topic is an important and timely one, and I believe this evening's conversation will contribute to the ideas that President Kennedy spoke of in an address before the American Newspaper Publishers Association on April 27, 1961. And while he was primarily referring to freedom of the press, I think his words reflect also the importance of freedom of speech when he stated, "Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive." And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. I'm now pleased to introduce tonight's panelists. Susan Benesch is a faculty associate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, teaches human rights at American University's School of International Service, and directs the Dangerous Speech Project. A human rights lawyer trained at Yale, she has also worked for the Center for Justice and Accountability, Amnesty International, and Human Rights First. Her interest in speech dates back to her first career as a journalist when she was the chief staff writer for the Miami Herald and wrote for a variety of magazines and websites. Jennifer Peter was recently appointed managing editor of the Boston Globe, helping to oversee all aspects of newsroom operations after more than 7 years as the Globe's Metro editor. She began her career as a reporter for 12 years, covering mainly politics at newspapers in Idaho, Connecticut, Virginia, and Massachusetts, and I hope not at the same time. She joined the Globe in 2004 as the editor of one of its regional editions, later becoming the State House editor, and then the city editor for 3 years before taking over as Metro editor. Carol Rose is executive director of the ACLU of Massachusetts. A lawyer and journalist, Carol has spent her career advocating for human rights and civil liberties, both in the U.S. and abroad, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Israel, the West Bank and Gaza, Northern Ireland, and Vietnam, among other countries. It's quite a list. She has also worked as an attorney at the Boston law firm of Hill and Barlow, where she specialized in First Amendment and media law, intellectual property, civil rights, and international human rights law, and previously has clerked for the U.S. District Court Judge Patty Saris. I'm also delighted to introduce our moderator for the evening, not because it's also the last one I have to do tonight. There's many panelists here, which is always a good thing. Bruce Gellerman is a journalist and senior correspondent who has won more than 50 national awards, frequently covering science, business, technology, and the environment. Bruce is a member of WBUR's Bostonomix team covering stories on the future of everything. He recently produced a 5-part investigative series that led to the overthrow of a conviction of a man in prison for 32 years for a murder he always insisted he did not do. So please join me in welcoming our speakers for this important conversation.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's delightful to be here. Afterwards, we're going to go for about an hour. We'll take your questions and answers. Don't be shy. There are mics, as you said. But please make it short and sweet, no kind of long discourses, okay? So I was thinking about, didn't know the real history of the First Amendment, and I'm not going to go through the First Amendment, except that it was an addendum to getting the Constitution ratified. And there were actually, when James Madison drafted the amendments, he actually came up with 12. Did you know that? You knew that. You knew that? Did you know that?
They're the legal scholars.
So I didn't know that. And so we actually should be talking about the Third Amendment, except the first two didn't get ratified. One of those did get ratified as the 27th Amendment, only recently. It has to do with congressional pay, I think. But we're going to talk about the first, and 12 simple words that pertain to free speech. It's longer because it talks about religion, it talks about redress of grievances and so on, but we're going to just talk about those 12 words. You think it'd be easy and simple, but it's really extraordinarily complicated. There have been some amazing decisions over the years in the Supreme Court, which when I went back and read them, I was embarrassed. And we can get into a little bit of that. There's kind of analogs to what's going on, I think, today. But here's a great question. I always try to figure out what's the first question in these things, because that's the one that starts things off, obviously. And I got it from you, Susan. You gave it was a little gift just before we walked in, which is, we heard today that Justice Stevens, former Justice Stevens, had said that he wanted to abolish or get rid of the Second Amendment, militia, guns, and so on. So the question is, do we need to redefine, to reword the First Amendment? And if you could, it's a hard question, what would you do? Since it was your question, why don't you take the first bite out of that apple?
No, I feel like I've planted not only the question, but the answer. As you point out, Bruce, the amendments were shifted around even as they were being passed. What we often forget is that they have been very, very differently interpreted over the course of their lives and of the life of our republic. So, like the Second Amendment, the First Amendment was interpreted very differently for most of our history. In other words, it was not understood to prevent the suppression of speech that the government didn't like, including, for example, speech encouraging people to resist the draft or communist speech. We have prosecuted and imprisoned people in some of our most famous First Amendment cases.
Which don't happen, really. There's not a lot of, maybe I'm wrong about this, Carol, you would know. There are not a lot of challenges to the First Amendment or cases until the 20th century, right?
Yes, we didn't even begin to reach our current understanding of the First Amendment until the 1960s. And some of the most important ideas with which we now interpret the First Amendment came in the early 20th century out of cases in which people were convicted, and the Supreme Court upheld those convictions.
A presidential candidate was convicted for free speech, for what he thought he was an exercise of his free speech, and he served in prison for 2 years.
So to finally get around to answering your question, it's the interpretation of the amendment that matters. I think just as much as its words. I absolutely don't think we should change its words, and I think we ought to protect our current radical interpretation of its meaning as well.
Which is the radical meaning?
I say radical because the United States is an extreme outlier in all the countries of the world in protecting speech so vigorously. For example, this is the only country in the world where hate speech is not only not prohibited, it is explicitly protected under our recent current interpretation of the First Amendment.
Well, I think it goes to the point about how, law is really a political animal. It's not as though judges are calling balls and strikes. That sometimes we pretend they do, and certainly when they're going under their Senate hearings, they pretend that that's what they do. But that isn't what happens. The courts are incredibly responsive to what's happening in the political arena, which is why it's so important to think about freedom of speech as critically linked to social movements, and particularly progressive social movements that have happened in our country. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, he really relied on having freedom of speech and freedom of the press so that his actions would be seen not only in the South, but by people throughout the country, so that he was pushing for larger social change. And I think we're seeing the same thing today with the March for Our Lives that people just had on Saturday. I mean, people needed to have the First Amendment so that they could exercise their views about the Second Amendment. So I actually really think that it's important to recognize that, as Susan said, the Constitution isn't frozen in time. It's a living, breathing document, and very much a political document. And I think that also is the way to go forward. My concern with having a constitutional convention and trying to rewrite it is that when you do that, you open it up to the people who are currently in power to have a lot of say over how we would rewrite it. And I'm not sure that that would give us the freedoms that we're looking for at this moment in history.
Please.
Just saying.
Jennifer?
And I'm sort of glad we all agree on this. When you even posing the question, I feel sort of aghast because I feel like this is so fundamental to what we and all journalists or most journalists are doing every day. The First Amendment, we rely on it. It's, you know, I was talking to some people before this panel about, and I don't come at it as a scholar, although I've certainly studied it in the past, but it's part of what we do every single day. And not just in the sense that what we are putting in the newspaper we have a right to do for the public's right to know, but we are also constantly going to court and using and saying that our right to know, we're challenging the government's decisions. We are asking for documents all the time, and the Globe and other newspapers time and time again have relied on the First Amendment to obtain important information about what our government's doing, and we're doing this every single day.
But can the government, and I know they do, kind of argue you into submission, right? Turn down your requests.
Oh, they do all the time.
Right?
All the time, and then we
So
fight.
there's a price.
Back.
It's freedom of speech, but you have to pay the price.
Well, I mean, they could charge us a lot of money for the documents we want, and we.
There's a case right now that you have, right?
Right. I mean, and we actually, I mean, this is unproven, but I think as the press has become, or the newspaper industry at least has become less solvent, there's been a sense if you charge enough money that we'll just back down. And that's one area we're really not willing to give. We'll modify our request. We will put in the paper that they're charging a WBUR reporter $10,000 for a request or others. And and we were active along with a lot of other newspapers in trying to get a better public information law. But it's a battle every day. But I feel like without the First Amendment, we're nowhere.
So each state has different, what they can. I don't think every state has a public records law, right, or where you can access the government's records. Federal ones has FOIA, Federal Office of Information.
Every state is different. So in Massachusetts, just last year, after it was a 4-year battle that we just passed reform of the public records law. And one of the things that we won was the ability to get documents electronically. Because we had, town clerks who would say, okay, it's going to cost all this money because I'm going to sit and photocopy. Sort of like Dan Ellsberg, every page is going to be photocopied. Well, you don't need to do that anymore. We can get it electronically. And in fact, it's often better for journalists to have it electronically.
Oh, absolutely.
So that was one of the big reforms that we got, along with a mechanism to actually make it enforceable. So it was really quite interesting. The Center for Public Integrity down in Washington had given Massachusetts, had given Massachusetts a grade of F on our public records
And what
law.
are we now? Because I'm
going to say a D.
Yeah.
We still have a long way to go.
Yeah, we got a long way to go.
Long way to go. But it's tremendously important, and to Jen's point, I think the ability to access information is sort of the other side of delivering the information. So the First Amendment includes needing to have access as well as being able to then publicize it to the public so that we can have a democracy.
But you said progressive organizations were oftentimes the one that are pushing the envelope here. But it was in the 60s, the Ku Klux Klan had a landmark decision that had to deal with the First Amendment, right? And that one is the one that defines whether your, hate speech there's a limit to it. And they said, well, there's only a limit if there's imminent danger that you're going to commit a crime. And the Ku Klux Klan got off. So let's talk a little bit about hate crimes in the way. How do I know, as a reporter or anybody else, when I'm being hateful? How do I know when I've reached, is that the limit of the First Amendment?
Well, if I might, a couple things. So that was the Brandenburg case, and that was a case about a racist and Ku Klux Klan member. And the court said, no, it wasn't imminent, it wasn't incitement, it wasn't targeted, so therefore it's protected. But 2 years later, right, a civil rights person was also accused of incitement, having to do with when they were having the strike of the businesses, and said, I'm going to break the neck of anybody who is it, Charles Evers, Medgar Evers' brother, I think, said, I'll break the neck of anybody who doesn't obey the strike, the boycott. And so, again, the white-owned businesses sued him. And the same ruling that had protected the Ku Klux Klan now protected Charles Evers in his desire. So what we are talking about is winning the principles. Right? And what too often happens is that the bad facts come up, and believe me, the ACLU doesn't look for bad facts. So we would like to have good facts, because good facts make better law. But too often the people who test the limits are people who use speech in ways that are really often abhorrent to reasonable people. But we win the principle because in the long run, it's the principle that more often than not protects traditionally oppressed groups and traditionally oppressed people. If you begin to go down the road toward censorship, invariably it's going to favor those who have privilege and power. And that's why it's important to understand that the principles behind these cases are tremendously important.
Yeah, and underlying that is this notion of this value, right? This fundamental sense of why do we need even a First Amendment? Why do we need a Second Amendment for that matter, right? I mean, what's the value and what is the value? The value being that, I guess when 300 years ago when they were formulating the country, it was that we don't want the government to get that powerful. Is that still where we are?
Well, the main reason for the First Amendment
Today
is originally was to protect the right of citizens to criticize the government, to hold the government to account. I would say that the spirit of the First Amendment in its current interpretation, first of all, it's still there for that same reason, and as Jen was describing it, fortunately, we have journalists like her using it that way vigorously every day. In my view, that is still its principal purpose. It has also become, however, a way of life and a way of running public discourse, running a society. So it does not protect against the expression of hate speech. On the contrary, as I said, our understanding of the First Amendment, our jurisprudence explicitly protects the expression of hate speech. Another very famous First Amendment case is Skokie v. Illinois. That's the case in which a Nazi organization wanted to march in a suburb of Chicago that had a large Jewish population and at the time had a particularly large proportion of Holocaust survivors of all people. That's where this American neo-Nazi party wanted to march. The town of Skokie attempted to prevent the march by passing various ordinances. The Nazi organization represented by the ACLU in a case that ended up causing lots of controversy in and outside the ACLU.
You represented the Nazis, and not you personally, but
Not me personally.
But am I right? Is that I remember this case at the time, right?
Yes, you did, yeah.
Yeah.
So the Illinois Supreme Court ended up overturning those local ordinances and protecting the right, upholding the right of these Nazis to march explicitly in a place where they knew they were going to cause terrible distress to people who lived literally along the parade route, or the proposed march route. In the end, they didn't march. But what we learned from that case is that protecting people from offense, from distress, even from arguably significant emotional harm is not one of the objectives of our law on speech in the United States.
Please.
I was saying more recently, the ACLU was supportive of the the Charlottesville rally. Wasn't there,
Right.
you guys had, or you nationally had a role in?
Right. So what happened, in Charlottesville is that the government had issued permits to both the neo-Nazis, alt-right, whatever they call themselves, on one hand, and to the other side. They had issued permits to both sides. And then they decided to withdraw the permit from one side, but not from the other side, or to actually move them to a different venue from one side or to not the other side. So looked at it from just a pure ahistorical point of view, it was a fairly straightforward, you can't have a viewpoint discrimination. You could remove it from both sides. If the government had made a showing that there was going to be actual danger, they could have removed it from, for that reason, but there was none of those showings. And so as a result, it became what I think initially the ACLU in Virginia assumed might not be that controversial a case, but of course turned out to be an incredibly controversial case. They also had gotten the people who had the permit to sign under court order an agreement that they wouldn't bring guns or use violence, which of course then they proceeded to violate. So it was a really tough case actually for the ACLU because the facts are so bad, right? But there are also so many facts where the cases where the facts are not bad. Think about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. Right? And our president saying that somehow he should be punished, or saying that Donald Trump saying that anyone who destroys the flag, should lose their citizenship. We have all these other instances, or Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Boston that we had here, where the ACLU was on that case. So whenever you have people sort of on the extremes of the political spectrum, or not even so extreme, frankly, from my point of view, on the social left, those are the cases that make it to court, and those are the cases that get the publicity. One of the things that was really different here, and I think is an interesting point of discussion, is that so when we found out that a week after the Charlottesville march, that there was going to be a march here in Boston, and they call themselves the Free Speech Marchers. I refuse to cede free speech to one side or the other of the political spectrum, so I just call them the bandstand people. So the bandstand people came, all 15 of them wanted to come here. First thing that we did at the ACLU was to contact, the police commissioner and the mayor's office and everybody else. And one of the things they said is, we're not going to allow people to come armed to the Boston Common, right? No big sticks with signs, no guns, no knives. We're not going to allow people to come armed. That was fine with the ACLU. We don't believe.
Hold, stop.
Let me just finish.
They could bring guns to the common?
They could not bring guns to the common.
Well,
we said that's correct. That's fine. That's in Massachusetts. In Charlottesville, they came armed, right? They came armed, open carry. So it really raises, to me, a very interesting jurisprudential or legal question. When I go to a rally and I'm armed and you come to a rally on the other side and you're not armed, do my Second Amendment rights trample your First Amendment rights? I think it's a really hard question, and I don't think the courts have approached it yet.
But in the Boston case, the way they configured the rally was the problem. At least for me, I was there, I covered it. Were you there?
I was not there, but.
Yeah, but were you there by perchance? So just so you know, so they had the rally, there was a group of people, and the day before the rally, the police and the mayor had us all together, the reporters, to have a press conference and said, instill confidence and tell us what measures they were taking. And the Boston police is pretty good at this, ordinarily, I think. In general, I think, pretty good. And I came away feeling really well. They would create an environment where they were separating the rally goers from the people who were protesting and holding the rally from the protesters. And there was going to be a column which you can go through to get to the stage. It's the Parkman bandstand.
The Parkman bandstand, right.
But when we got there, it was amazing.
Right.
I mean, they may have put the bandstand on the moon, because you were about 150 yards. They had a fence all the way around with this kind of bullpen going down by fences that people that were in the rally were getting frisked and all the rest going to the bandstand. But the reporters couldn't get anywhere near. We couldn't do our job. It was absurd.
And there was no amplification.
What's that?
And there was no amplification.
And there was no amplification,
Well,
which is...
to make it better, I just have to say, just to improve the situation slightly, was when the police commissioner went on TV and said, yeah, we kept the media away, because, we hate that viewpoint.
Yeah,
we don't
need to hear. You don't need to hear. Which is an interesting question. Where in the free speech is the question that both you raised is your right to have free speech? Do I have a right to hear?
Yeah.
Do I have a right to hear?
You as a journalist, you as the public?
Anybody, the public. Do I have a right to hear hateful speech?
They have a right to reach their intended audience. So it's less about your right to hear than their right to have you hear them, right?
be
So,
heard.
right. So what we did, when they came back with the second rally then in November, right? So the first rally was in August on the Boston Common. There was a subsequent rally in November. What we did is to represent journalists, right? Because my client is ultimately the First Amendment. So if I can find a way to represent the First Amendment without having to fall into the Charlottesville problem, I'll do that. And because there had been such an explicit, both in deed, but also in the written forms of the city, to say we're going to exclude journalists because, you know, every time you let those journalists in there, man, it just riles people up. So we need to shut that down.
Yeah, they did. They were very effective.
Right. And so what we did in the November rally was to say, to contact the city ahead of time and say, if you do that again, we actually are going to have to take you to court because you cannot do that. You cannot shut down freedom of the press because that's an important part of the First Amendment as well. And so we were able to do that. And we had legal observers there. I'm not sure they would have done it if we hadn't had people on the ground going with journalists up to the fence and saying, we have a right to be here. And so I think it really helped for us to do that. But these are, you know, evolving and learning processes. But I think that this notion, still, I want to go back to saying the notion if one side is heavily armed and the other side isn't, what happens when those rights are in conflict? And I think that's really, really troubling. But I do think that Boston did it really well in November. I think we did a good job because the media, for the most part, was able to reach the bandstand and to amplify their message, even an odious message that many people don't agree with. They still have a right to have their message be heard. And that's what we were able to do.
It is, in my view, alarming, by the way, that a public official would say, oh, we kept the journalists away, you know, because after
We don't want to hear that here. That's what he said.
I
He's
am
very well intentioned. He's just not. He needed to be given his talking points.
I mean,
Fair enough, and I don't mean to criticize one public official. What I wanted to mention is that I see plenty of signs of decreasing awareness that we have this, I think, wonderfully radical, lusty, free speech regime in this country. In other words, what we hear, of course, President Trump speaking in ways that suggest that he's never heard of the First Amendment. In his case, perhaps not so surprising. I don't know about well-intentioned. But there are, I think, increasing signs that Americans are unaware of and not deeply supportive of the First Amendment as a governing principle. That's really what I wanted to point out.
That's scary.
For example, the Pew did a study recently, a survey, asking Americans of various different ages, various different generations, how they would balance free speech with prohibition of hate speech. And the younger the people were, the more willing they were to sacrifice free speech in order to prohibit various kinds of speech they didn't like.
And the Brookings Institution just had an interesting survey of college students. 20% of college students that they surveyed, it was about 2,000 kids nationwide, said that they thought it was appropriate to actually use violence to shut down speech that you don't agree with, which is really a stunning statistic. But the one thing I want to say to this about this generational shift is that, I mean, when you think about it, from my generation, I was raised thinking that freedom of speech was tremendously important, for the civil rights movement. It was tremendously important for the anti-war movement. Tremendously important, for the Watergate era.
Right.
Freedom of the press.
All the president's men.
That's why we all became journalists at some point.
Right.
Right? So freedom. So that was my generation, and free speech was very much aligned of the Berkeley free speech movement with civil rights, with social progress. But my children's generation have been raised in a very different world where they were really raised on an anti-bullying curriculum, which I am very supportive of. They were also reared at a time when the internet was magnifying speech in ways that we could never have thought of, where people would be trolled and targeted and things like that. So we have a different lived experience, I think, of the generation that's coming of age now than we did of our generation. And I'm not suggesting that one generation is right or one is wrong, but I think if we begin to understand the different lived experience of these different generations, and we begin to see that people of intelligence and integrity are drawing the lines in different places. We can begin to have a dialogue that if we sort of demonize one generation or the other generation as being right or wrong or smart or dumb, that we lose that. And I think trying to understand that, how different the world is, I think, to my children's generation than it was to my generation, begins to open up a dialogue that I think we desperately need to have in this country so that we can protect freedom of speech.
I was thinking about Lenny Bruce would watch TV now. He'd blush by what they allow, right? I mean, the guy would be embarrassed. So this notion of, I know why, when I think of the First Amendment, and I don't often think about it, I know why I do what I do, which is, I have a job, right? My job is to communicate. My job is to open up. I'm not there to conceal information. I'm there to give information. And so this notion of sunshine, right? That I know it's hokey, inspires me, is that sunshine disinfects. We expose the rats and all the critters run away, and we've done our job. Hokey in today's world?
Not necessarily successful in today's world, but right now.
Because?
Because I think the truth is taking a beating, right? And truth is no longer empirical, it's opinion. And I think, but I do think in the end it's the sunshine, it's the disinfectant that will ultimately, I think, prevail. But I think it's not quite as powerful right now.
So what do you do as you're managing reporters. They come to you with big problems. I come to my editors with big problems. And it's happening more and more that I'm wrestling with the truth. What's a fact? What's accurate? What's honest? What's truthy?
I don't feel like the journalists have changed. I feel like it's, as you say, the Twitter and Facebook, and people tend to listen to the people in their friends on Facebook, or they follow on Twitter people who amplify what they believe. And so I don't know that the journalists are doing anything different. In fact, I think they're doing incredible work. And I think people at the Globe are, but I do think on the national stage, I think the Times and the Post are doing a huge service to the country, but it doesn't always seem to doesn't have the same impact right now in the moment. I'm hoping cumulatively, historically, the truth will prevail, but it can be immediately dismissed by people high and low as somehow not true, even when they've got videos or documents. Just facts are taking a beating. But I think sunlight is the only thing that's going to ultimately make it better.
Well, Carol, you were saying that they could take, you would take them to court. You'd take the police to court with all the confidence in the world that the courts were going to rule in your favor.
Well, First Amendment jurisprudence, probably of all the different amendments that the ACLU works on, is probably the most settled law. I mean, when it's a pure First Amendment free speech case, in general, the courts are still pretty sympathetic to it. But I think what's changing now is the technology, the medium and the message, and when the medium becomes the message, right? Was that Marshall McLuhan or somebody said that? But but I think when the medium changes so dramatically, then suddenly we begin to have rights in conflict. So my right to be on a university campus and to have an ability to function on a university campus, when does that run into the buzzsaw of your free speech rights to say things that don't make me feel good? I think there's a lot of conversations around trafficking and on Backpage and all these things. So there's all these times where the rights become in conflict, and then the courts get involved. And I think when you have that, it's a little bit different than when just a pure free speech, was my speech censored or not? That's a pretty straightforward case. But I think it's a little bit different. And when you get onto college campuses, that's where a lot of it, not only is that where the action is taking place on this, but these are future leaders of our country.
But we see the exact opposite of what happened in the Berkeley free speech movement.
Exactly.
We have colleges shutting down, people whose speech they don't like, hateful speech and despicable speech, call it what you want, dangerous speech.
Yeah, I was just reading on a history of Stokely Carmichael, who was, of course, one of the first people of the UC Berkeley free speech movement. And, he was going to go on campus. He'd been down registering people to vote down in the South, and then he'd gotten arrested and beaten up, and he went to talk about it. And it was Ronald Reagan running for governor who said, we don't want to have those dissidents, maybe they have free speech rights, but why should we make our platforms available to them? Right? Isn't that interesting? Now, if Stokely Carmichael went to Berkeley today, it's not clear that he would be allowed to speak because of the free speech codes that they have on some of the campuses. So it's really interesting how the political tides change and seem to change the conversation, as they should. But at the same time, if we begin to think, always going back to our first principles about freedom of speech, and I just really feel strongly that I hope that for the college students out there and the young people out there, not to cede the notion of free speech to the alt-right, to one side or the other, and to not think that you can actually win the argument by censoring speakers that you don't agree with or censoring people you don't agree with. Because I think in the end, those tools of censorship will be turned against those who lack power. So that's why I do it.
But manipulating speech too, that is, you can use speech very powerfully as a weapon.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
Absolutely.
so where is that limit? You've written and worked in that field, that area. Is hate speech allowed? Is that allowable? Is that part of, I mean, is settled law? It's okay if you say hateful stuff.
Hate speech is protected. Hate crimes, you can have enhanced punishment for hate crimes. So if the underlying crime is motivated by hatred, often expressed in speech, you can have increased penalties, just like you have first-degree murder versus second-degree murder, right? It goes to motive. So that's permissible under the Constitution. But punishing speech as speech, no, that speech is protected by the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. So what about a dangerous speech? When does hate become dangerous?
Let me just add a little footnote from the Brandenburg case that we discussed before. This is the case from Ohio in which a man stood up in a field with just a few other people standing there and said terribly hateful things and also called for specific things to happen. Mr. Brandenburg said that, I won't repeat the very ugly things he said, but he called for specific things to be done to African Americans and to Jews. And that case, as we said before, led to this specific jurisprudence in which speech like that is only criminal in the United States if there is a probability of, we now call it, imminent lawless action. In other words, if it is fairly likely that people will respond with violence, that they will respond to that
So what about
instigation with violence. And in the case of Brandenburg, that didn't happen.
Lock her up. Does that instigate people to violence?
Again, there has to be a probability of imminent lawless action.
So if somebody's in the crowd and they carry him away because he's speaking against the person who says that, they carry him out of the, is that a violation of whose?
That's assault and battery.
That's assault and battery.
And that's where, this is the thing, our law, as Carol said, distinguishes, although that's not always easy, between speech and action. So hate crime is one thing in American law, and it is, of course, as its name suggests, a crime. Hate speech as such is not. However, this very narrow category of hate speech in which you are also trying to incite people to violence and you're likely to have some success with that pretty soon, and you can hear all the caveats, right? All the specific qualifications that narrow the category. So that is criminal, that particular tiny subset of hate speech.
But we should say it because the First Amendment is about government. It's not about individuals, right? So you could say anything, right? I mean, you're in the public realm, you can say anything just as long as it's not about the government.
No,
No, not at all. As I said, you could incite people to violence.
To violence.
And if it is relatively, if there's a probability that imminent lawless action will result, that's a crime. There are other kinds of speech that are also criminal. There's something called true threats. If you threaten somebody in such a fairly small subcategory of ways of threatening people, that's also criminal. So we shouldn't misunderstand the First Amendment in the other direction to imply that all speech is permitted. it is not. You also can't threaten to assassinate the president, for example.
I'm reminded of after the Tsarnaev thing, we had a shelter in place, right? And everybody went into their house and just shut up. But it turns out, and maybe, I'm not sure of this, I don't think there's such a law as called shelter in place. I mean, they can declare martial law, right? There's martial law, but that's law. There's no such thing. Why did we all go into our house and lock the doors and stop the tea?
Well, I was making a few phone calls that afternoon, just going to set the record straight on that, because they were not ordering people to shelter in place. They were asking them to shelter in place. And after we talked, they made that clear to people that they were doing that. And I think because, quite honestly, I mean, there were people driving around, shooting people. And it was scary. And I think that was, why they asked people to do it. And I think it's why people agreed to do it. But after a certain amount of time, I was raising some questions about, well, how are you going to help people get to their medical appointments? How are you going to help people who, need to get to the hospital, or who, for whatever reasons, right? People are going to need to move out of their houses, and then they lifted it. Before, in fact, they found him in the boat. So they ended up lifting it. But there were there were conversations going on between the ACLU and city leaders and state officials throughout that time period. But they did issue a clarification, which didn't immediately get picked up in the press, that it wasn't a shelter-in-place order, it was a shelter-in-place request.
But fear is very powerful, right? They made it, and people, I think, was very fragile. I know I was afraid. I was covering it. I was in Watertown. I didn't come off that parking lot.
Right.
There were a couple of reporters, and they were much more courageous, I guess, or something like that. But it felt like it was. I mean, we were in an armed camp, right? You had the state, and you had the feds, and you had the troopers, and you had helicopters, and you had all these guys running around with shotguns, and you name it. It was scary, but my reaction was, I felt like a coward. Here I'm championing the First Amendment, and I really believe in it, and, I didn't push the limit. I sat in my car.
But when you talk about fear, I mean, isn't that, that's what was motivating, I think, probably, I wasn't inside his head, but Commissioner Evans before the Boston protests. There was a fear that what happened in Charlottesville that was so awful could happen here. I think public safety for that period of time was certainly the primary concern that in the end ended up wounding free speech. And I'm not saying that's right, but I mean, I think fear is, and that is always the attention, right? That, and I think that was such what happened in Charlottesville, there was so much fear and can we do better here? And again, not to excuse what they did in keeping the press away, but I think the context of it, I think there were a lot of people who are frightened, and I think that's human, right? I mean,
yeah, no, I mean, we all believe in public safety. Who doesn't believe in public safety? What's the limit of public safety really is? And I remember I was, Scott Simon that does a show out of Washington, he called me that morning. I was on the Common covering this thing, and he said, so, this happened there, what about this is Boston? I said, listen, Scott, this is Boston. We know how to do this. And I was wrong. They didn't know how to do it. We got locked out.
But I think it's hard. I mean, I think whenever you have rights in conflict, right, is when you have the most interesting legal cases, the most interesting public discussions, but it's uncomfortable to have them. And I think it's important to recognize there are trade-offs that we make as a society all the time. There are limits on speech. There isn't unfettered free speech in this country. Obscenity is not protected. True threats are not protected. And, there was an interesting case on the true threats and imminent harm in the Ninth Circuit, which is out on the West Coast, having to do with the Nuremberg Files case, they called it. And somebody put up a website, and they put abortion providers' faces up, and sort of with a wanted, I can't remember if it said dead or alive, but it was, a wanted poster. And then whenever one of them was attacked or shot, they would put a line through them. When they were hurt, they put one line through them, and then they put an X through them when they got killed. And so the question was this incitement? And the court ruled that it was, in fact, incitement, and that it was not protected speech. So there are actually a fair number of cases where public safety and potential violence, or whether it's there are restrictions in the workplace on what you can and can't do that creates a hostile work environment. There are restrictions in learning environments for a hostile learning environment. So there are actually when people say, we have free speech, it's unfettered, well, not exactly. And so the question really becomes, where do we draw the lines? Not do we draw the lines, because in fact, as a society, we do draw the lines. And the concern that I have is that the motive to try to censor as the way to get more public safety or to make us feel better, all of those kinds of things, it feels good in the immediate sense to sort of say that, but in the end, I always think that it's the people with the power and the privilege who will benefit. And it's the people without the power and the privilege who are pushing for greater equality who will win if we have greater speech. I think of it a little bit like a chess match. So, you might have to give up your pawn when you let somebody you disagree with come and speak. But if you give up free speech, you're giving up your queen, and you're going to lose the game in the long run.
Can the First Amendment withstand technology today? Twitter, it's so quick and it's so divisive, it's so polarizing, right? I mean, it divides the lines very starkly. And I'm not confident of that, to be honest with you. Every day seems like an assault, that we're redefining the lines, we're reinforcing the lines. It's you versus me, it's us, it's the Hitu versus the Tutsi, it's the Nazis versus everybody else. It's the Aryans versus. It's unfettered right now, and this transcends the notion of governments intervening, although maybe perhaps it doesn't, because they seem to be doing pretty good job of polarizing us.
I want to go back to something you said, Bruce, about, if I may.
Please.
About sunlight as a disinfectant. That is a wonderful term, and it's very apt. But
is it old-fashioned?
Oh, it's a good term, or a good phrase, maxim. It was created, though, like the First Amendment, in a particular context, and that is with regard to government. The idea is to shine sunlight into the nooks and crannies of governmental activity so that the public can see it, right? It's the sunlight is the best disinfectant, is the animating spirit of the Freedom of Information Act, for example. But then I got the sense that you were talking about sunlight shining elsewhere. One thing that Twitter and that the internet and social media have done in general, you could argue, is to shine sunlight everywhere by giving almost everyone a voice. So that the Boston Globe and the Post and the Times are publishing terrific stuff, but so is everybody else publishing stuff all over the internet. Exactly.
We're blinded by the light.
Reporting and journalism and so forth. So this has, of course, changed the game of public discourse spectacularly. All of us can arguably take part in public discourse and in what we might ourselves like to call journalism. And then a problem from the point of view of people who love truth and accurate reporting is that many readers or viewers don't seem to be able to distinguish between true, well-researched, accurate journalism and whatever their friend on Facebook is posting. That's a new and different problem, and yes, in a way, it is the consequence of more people having more opportunity to reach their intended audience. I think, though, that it's also providing a great opportunity that we haven't noticed. And I'm going to make this
a good opportunity or a bad?
Yeah. Well, but you asked us not to go on and on.
Please.
Sure. Okay. It is very okay. Let me just think of how to say it quickly. There's a human habit that all people engage in without thinking about it, in my view, and that is to talk in a specific way when they think they're talking to their own. You're around your kitchen table talking to your family. You're speaking with the people in your religious group, in your clan, other people of the same identity, however you understand that. And you speak in a certain way, you say certain things that you wouldn't say if you thought that there were people outside that group present. This is talking, we could say this is talking to our own. And we say things that would offend people outside our own kitchen if we knew that they were listening. So if you think pre-internet, people did that all the time. Now what often happens is they post the same sort of stuff on Facebook, mistakenly thinking that they are talking to their own. So to take an example, I have to take some example, I'm not trying to pick on any particular group. If a man wanted to tell a joke that women would find offensive, in the past he might have told it, I'm going to use some stereotypes here, on a hunting trip, in a locker room, in a smoke-filled room, okay? And he would have known who the audience was, and he knew those people, probably other men, and could predict their response. Now that content goes up online, and sooner or later, some pesky women or other men who don't think it's funny will see it and will be in some way distressed by it, but also probably will hold the guy to account sooner or later. So he's being held to account by other, I would say in my, maybe wearing my little small academic hat, this is holding somebody to different normative standards, which is a friction-filled, distressing process. And in the medium to long run, I think it's very good. We're just we're in the distressing mess of it. So we don't see the gradual, very salutary shifts that I think are going on.
But some messages seem to have tapped into things that people wouldn't have said around the kitchen table.
Absolutely.
Right? And empowers that kind of action, speech, policy, direction, you name it.
But isn't there a sense, there has been more hate speech, there have been more hate crimes in the last couple of years, it's been documented, but I think there's an interesting debate. Are people actually having their opinions changed by certain people in political power, or did they feel this way all along but didn't feel like they could say something about it? And I'm not saying that I embrace the hateful speech, but it's actually illuminating to know that my fellow citizens feel this way. And there's a lot of things that I've been surprised about. And I do think it is I think it's helpful to know, even if painful, and
Right.
even if it does inflict pain. I think to pretend that we are this monolithic society where the politically correct,
Well, we used to have the Globe and the Herald, right? So I knew where the Herald was, and you knew where the
still
Globe
have
was.
the Globe and the Herald.
We do, we do. But those audiences spoke to there, and now you're saying you have to be more inclusive, more thoughtful, more.
Well, no, I think the news portions of, and I won't speak for the Herald, but for the Globe, I think we're doing the same thing we always did, which is trying to, and I think succeeding in reporting truthful stories. They were holding people accountable, whether they're Republican or Democrat. And we do have an opinion page, which has an opinion, which is quite separate from what I'm involved in. I just think to pretend that people to not know that there are people out there with hateful feelings I don't think that's helpful to our society. I think it is something that potentially, I guess that's an optimistic way of looking at it, that we are seeing something come to light that hopefully we can begin to address rather than pretending it's not there.
But I think, I agree with you for the most part, but it also has the danger of normalizing bad behavior. I had a friend call me up after the Stormy Daniels story first broke and said, "Oh, this is it, man. This is good." And I said, "Yeah, no. What it's going to do is normalize having porn stars in the White House." It's like because it becomes like Teflon. Like we get used to it.
It's a speed bump. It didn't even get any play afterwards.
Right.
It's gone. It's history.
I think that's different. I think the president is, I guess just in general, I think having a discussion about these things and realizing that there are people out there who feel so incredibly different about things that I thought we all universally held. I think putting our head in the sand and pretending that.
Well, no, and I agree with you. And what's really been great from my point of view is then we have Time's Up, right? And the Me Too campaigns and the March for Our Lives campaign. So this goes back to the notion that when it comes out there, people use their counter speech. They use their speech to then rise up and say, no more. And if we, query whether or not we would have had the Time's Up movement if we hadn't had the coverage and the press reports of what's going on. So it's all very historical and very political, right? These things are not, the principles are set, but the history surrounds it, and we see these pendulum swings, right? So now that we have people who, maybe before November of 2016, wouldn't have paid a whole lot of attention to what was going on, but now they're rising up, now they're marching. The Women's March, the March for Our Lives, these are great things that are happening, all of which need speech in order to be successful. And maybe if we hadn't had the bad news, the hate speech, the ugliness coming out, people wouldn't have been motivated to do that. So, I was sort of teasing about the Stormy Daniels thing, but I think you're absolutely right, that this, by shining the sunlight on it, by making it come to the fore, other people then rise up and say, I can't be silent any longer. And that's great.
And of course, this has never been a country, nor has any country been a place without hatred. It's never been a place where some people around their kitchen tables did not say stunningly hateful and violent things. It's that we are now more aware of what people are thinking and saying. And as you say, Jen, it may be that such speech is becoming more acceptable in some quarters, or that it's becoming more acceptable to say certain things online. Two things. First of all, I'm not convinced of that. It is not, in fact, documented that there has been a rise in hate speech or even hate crimes since, hate speech or hate crimes motivated by speech, since our record keeping for that in this country is extremely poor. We don't actually know, just to specify that.
So the ADL reports that come out saying there's been seen an increase. I know it's always, are people being more sensitive to it now? Is it always happening? They're just reporting it more, but there have been reports.
The Southern Poverty Law Center, for example, collected 1,000 cases, approximately 1,000 cases in the 100 days after Trump's inauguration. It's a very distressing data set, but they weren't doing it before the inauguration, and so we don't have real comparative data. I think it's likely, but we should distinguish between what we think is probably the case and what we really know. The other tremendously important point, I think, when we talk about the First Amendment as, in my view, a culture, is that it now falls to all of us to declare and reinforce our discourse norms. In other words, to say clearly and publicly that it is not acceptable to say certain things. Informal law, we could call it, or informal norms, are enormously powerful. I'll give you just one illustration. It's a small one, and it's nowhere near strong enough in my view, but it's still powerful. I often ask my students, what is the likelihood that an American political candidate will use the N-word, knowing that the microphone is on? I give you. What is the likelihood? What do you think, you in the audience? 0. It is 0. Why? Is it illegal? No, it's not at all illegal. On the contrary, it's a constitutionally protected right. But it is culturally, informally, utterly prohibited. And that prohibition is virtually 100% enforced. So that's very powerful, and it's important to remember that. A second very important thing to remember about informal discourse norms is that they can change remarkably quickly. There were probably places in the United States only 60 or 70 years ago where you couldn't have gotten elected if you didn't use that kind of language. Think about that for a second. That's stunning. And we have seen in the last 20, 25 years, for example, if you'd said to me 20 years ago that there would be a term marriage equality and that it would have the meaning that it has now, and that prominent Republicans would say things like marriage equality is a conservative issue, I would have said, maybe you should be careful about that stuff you're smoking,
Boy,
I have a question for Jen.
Well, let me just break in just for a sec. We're going to invite you to exercise your First Amendment. Please try not to, put it in a box. Ask your questions away. We're going to try to get to as many people as possible. Step up to the mics. Carol, you were saying?
Yeah, no, I had a question for Jen about, and this is a free speech or free press question as much as a free speech question. So, given the algorithms now that we know are out there that are able to generate fake speech or fake news, and counterfactual things. And they're very hard, whether they're photographs or stories or whatever, they're very hard to spot. Are you aware of any, I know that the Shorenstein Center at the John F. Kennedy School of Government is doing some trainings for journalists on how to spot fake news versus real news and stuff like that. Is that becoming part of the training that journalists are getting now at the Globe and at other places? And query whether we should be giving that to also our students in our schools as part of their civic education.
I mean, I think that's a great idea. I think there have been certainly cases recently, like that case with the Washington Post and the Roy Moore accuser who turned out to be working for the other side or trying to discredit the Post. And I think it sent a sort of a shiver down everyone's back to hear that. I mean, the fact is, the way they figured that out is through fundamental journalism that we're supposed to be doing, anyways, where no matter, in fact, it's good, no matter how good the story is, and even if it's a really good story, you're even more suspicious, and you look at the background of the person, and you always get multiple sources for information, and I think there have been times in pursuit of good stories that obviously there are journalists who have made mistakes by not following those rules, and it was a really good reminder that we have to stick by the fundamentals, that be aggressive in your pursuit of stories, but check and double check and triple check and make sure you're doing everything possible to understand the veracity of it. But I think it would be, we haven't instituted something formal at the Globe, but I think it's a really smart idea, because it can discredit us awfully quickly if we fall into a trap.
Please.
So my question, so who are given the right of free speech by the First Amendment? Is it citizens of the United States, resident, undocumented? How about the foreigners using the same platform like Facebook?
I don't even know where to go with
people.
that. It's a good question.
So you don't have to be a U.S. citizen.
The line between the free speech and the interference.
And which?
Interference from the foreigners.
From foreign countries.
Yeah.
Right, well, it's a great question because, where are the borders, right? And so I think as long as people are living in this country, whether they're U.S. citizens or not U.S. citizens, they have the protections of this country when it comes to freedom of speech, because freedom of speech is freedom from the government silencing you in this country. If you get extradited because you violated, speech codes from another country, I don't know exactly how that would work and whether our government would turn someone over. I would like to think they wouldn't, but I don't know.
Sir.
Good evening. I work for a radio station at a local college. The ACLU has a wonderful program where you can get copies of the Constitution. And I got a phone call one day, and somebody asked me, "Hey, don't you ever talk about conservative stuff?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Look, there's two buttons on your radio. One, change the channel. The other, you can turn off. I don't care. Use one of them." What I did is I went and I got my personal copy of the Constitution and read the First Amendment over the air. I immediately got like 40 calls, and people said, "Where'd you get that?" I said, "Duh." I mean, come on, go on the net. The ACLU, out of my own personal pocket, I have bought and sent out down at Boston College over 350 constitutions.
Great.
And I thank them for that wonderful job that they do. And for you guys, for all of you, to stand up for the rights of each person is a wonderful thing. Because the minute you shut somebody up, they can come around and shut you up.
Hear, hear.
So never give up that right. Stand powerful.
What's interesting, though, now the world FCC used to regulate the airwaves because it was a commodity. It was a regulated, domain. Now you can be in that domain, but most are not.
Right. There's no equal share. There's no equal time rule anymore.
Right.
That used to exist.
Let's go back and forth.
Hi. One common objection I get when talking about hate speech and when defending the First Amendment is that hate speech silences the hated, as in hate speech with no incitement, no threats, no conspiracy, etc., by itself, usually from the dominant to the marginalized, silences, chills the free speech, exercise of free speech by the marginalized, usually then used to justify using violence to stop the hate speech. What would be your response to this objection? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand the question, to be honest with you.
I do. May
Okay,
I
please.
answer? That's a very important point, I think, and it has been made especially eloquently by Professor Jeremy Waldron in a book called The Harm in Hate Speech that was published 3 or 4 years ago, and it's a kind of a book-length elaboration on 3 brilliant lectures he gave at Harvard, around here, in other words. So he's arguing that hate speech by frightening and by harming the dignity of people, typically people who are already in some way disfavored or marginalized in society, harms their capacity to participate, for example, in democratic life, and therefore it harms not only them, but the whole society, particularly a representative democracy. I worry about that, and it has made me hesitate in my strong free speech position. I think that we must resort to the strong exercise of informal speech norms, as I was saying, to support people who are attacked, particularly online, and to denounce those who attack them. There are also ways in which I think that internet social media platforms can adjust what we in that sphere call platform architecture, so that the platforms do not make it even easier to attack people and harder to defend those who are being attacked.
But the leaders established the limits of law. We always go back to Hitler, and talk about how he incited people and used propaganda, objectifying people, calling them, cockroaches and so on. And when you were talking, I was thinking of how we had a reporter being mocked by a presidential candidate for his disability. Does that take your cultural norms and?
It's appalling, and I don't think, in fact,
are our
that's
cultural norms?
That's a particularly good example, Bruce, because prohibiting that by law would not have solved the problem at all. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't have stopped the president from doing it, clearly, and you would not have mitigated the harm that journalist suffered. Mm-hmm.
So
because for one thing, the punishment would have come after the fact, right? Prior censorship is an extremely bad idea for all kinds of reasons. So if you punish people for speech after the fact, and another reason why I'm a strong defender of the First Amendment and very skeptical of laws prohibiting hate speech is that very often in practice, Carol has a couple of times made the extremely important point that such laws tend to be used exactly against the people they ought to be used to protect. And then a second reason why such laws in practice don't work well is that they often only give more attention and more publicity to the hate speech and to the people who are making it. For example, just one example off the top of my head, Geert Wilders is a particularly hate-filled Dutch politician who has been prosecuted in the Netherlands several times for hate speech. And the most recent time, he and his party rose dramatically in the polls in the course of the prosecution.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but I want to just acknowledge, I think, we protect words not because, we protect them because they are powerful. And I think that words can hurt people, actually. And that's why it's important that we are mindful about the words, that we exercise our free speech to defend the rights of people who are being marginalized by those words. But I also want to reiterate that I think, it's a little bit like Marxism is a great critique of capitalism, not a great alternative in practice. And I think that when we do our critique of how words can be harmful and can hurt, then we have to go immediately to sort of what's the remedy. And my concern with censorship is that it tends to, not only does it give more power to the powerful, but it does really turn people into martyrs. And I think, we had, what is it, Milo Yiannopoulos out at Berkeley, and he was going to go out, and there was a big protest, and he got tons and tons of press, and his message got out, and everybody had to listen to it. And then when he came back, and there was just a decision not to pay any attention to him, right, at all, he ended up folding his tent and going home. So I really think it's important that rather than censoring, sometimes ignoring, shunning, there are a lot of other tools in our toolkit that we can use. And then the obligation to raise our voices. I mean, a lot of people, I've got some people who were critical of the ACLU in last August when I personally decided to march with the anti-white supremacy groups and said, well, you're just supposed to be defending free speech, not exercising your own. And I said, no, that's nonsense. Not only do I have a right to exercise it, but I think there's an obligation that goes along with that right to exercise it, to raise our voice for the values that we believe in. And so I think that words are powerful, and to your point, I think they're very powerful. And I think, in addition to Jeremy Waldron, I think that Chuck Lawrence and others have made really compelling cases that I urge everybody to read, because these aren't simple. Even though the three of us or the four of us are somewhat in agreement, there are a lot of people with a lot of intelligence and integrity who actually think we should draw the lines in different places, and I think it's worth reading what they have to say and forcing ourselves to confront those arguments. So thank you for that.
Please.
And speaking of drawing the line, you might, it's been a while, but you might remember when I was introduced, I founded and run something called the Dangerous Speech Project, which is, might strike you as strange since you've heard me defending the First Amendment so vigorously. I coined the term dangerous speech for language or any kind of communication that increases the chances that people will commit or condone violence against another group of people. So not only do I think that speech, that hateful speech can harm, I think that speech can and does really directly increase the risk of violence. I spend most of my time now working on that. So it's absolutely not that I'm not concerned about this. On the contrary, I'm just struggling to find the most effective ways of undermining the harms that speech brings about.
Please.
Thank you. My name is Joe Murray, and I think that one of the things that I think is the greatest thing attacking free speech today is tolerance. Many of these people standing right here know what tolerance is, because we've stood here waiting to be asked, allowed to be asked a question, and you just continue to talk over us, and we've been tolerant of that. But I'm here to tell you that tolerance is not alive today in this country, and neither is civility. And I was very pleased to hear you mention that the First Amendment seems to have been taken over by the progressive movement in this country. And the progressive movement doesn't own the First Amendment. But I was also glad to hear you say that you need two sides, and you need to be tolerant of the other side as well. So there are 3 R's that I suggest we need to bring back to the country. One of them is respect. That's respect for the other person's rights. The other one is responsibility. Take responsibility for what you do and say. And the third one is recidivism. That means that if you're going to give somebody the right to speak, then step back and listen and let them speak too. Maybe we'd learn something. One of the things that I
don't mean to tread on your free speech, but this
Yes, you are.
But this is a question and answer.
Question, go ahead.
Do you have a question, please?
I do. My question is, have you heard about the bird? The bird that was an eagle. The eagle is what our country is all about. The national bird is the eagle. Well, someone found a bird with a broken wing, and he called the vet, and he said to the vet, this eagle can't soar anymore. And he said, why? He says, it's got a broken wing. He says, which wing is it? He says, what difference does it make? It can't soar as long as it doesn't have both wings. That's my question. When are we going to get get back to tolerance and civility.
Thank you.
I used to be a criminal lawyer, and I was always struck by the fact that the Fourth Amendment rights have to be asserted in order to come to life. You don't get the right to a speedy trial handed to you, and you don't get the right to an attorney handed to you. You have to assert those rights as the defendant. My question to you is, do you think it would be appropriate to use that same spirit to inform the First Amendment rights? In other words, should we be asserting our rights rather than thinking they're just there for us when we feel like it?
Well, I think that's in the term. It's interesting because the way this First Amendment, forgive me if I don't, it's the exercising. Isn't that part of the definition in the first, or the description, right? The government shall not inhibit anyone's ability to exercise their freedom of religion and so on. So it's that exercise, it's that verb. You've got to exercise your rights.
And we assert it all the time. I mean, as a working journalist, I feel like we're asserting it all the time. I guess is the question whether it only should be invoked if you assert it, and it, I mean.
No, more like the obligation that you were talking about. Should we be viewing our First Amendment rights more as our obligation rather than, gee, when I feel like it, I'll get around to it? Shouldn't we all be engaging more because it's our obligation to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there is an obligation along with an opportunity. I think that too often we assume someone else is going to be out there defending our rights, whether it's First or Fourth Amendment. I was sort of thinking, no, let's make the Fourth Amendment more automatic. That's where my head was going. But I actually think it's really important, and it is like a muscle. Like, we have to exercise it. And so it's interesting, you know, people talk about despair across the country for all sorts of reasons right now, and across the world. And for one of the things that I think about is, you know, I am not going to be satisfied if we merely survive the next 4 years and sort of get through it. I actually think we have an opportunity to emerge a stronger democracy, a more resilient democracy than we started out with, because people are no longer assuming someone else will defend my rights. So yeah, I think there's an obligation and an opportunity, and actually we can really emerge a better republic. That's my hope.
I couldn't agree more, and that's what I was trying to say when I spoke about informal norms and the opportunity and also the obligation for us to make clear as a society that tolerance and civility are also fundamental principles for us, and to call out the sorts of speech that would have horrified Lenny Bruce and that horrify us.
Please.
This actually comes from a viewer watching from Texas. And Susan, it's sort of directed to what you were talking about when you said that younger people are more willing to give up some of their speech to prevent hate speech. The question is, well, where is that line drawn? I think this can be addressed to any of you, but where is the line drawn, if there's a line? This person believes there's no such thing as what he would call limited free speech.
I'm not sure I understand the question, to be honest. Anybody?
I think what he's trying to say is, like, if these younger people are drawing a line on where they give up some of their speech to protect hate speech, where would you draw that line if you would draw that line? I think that's what he's trying to say.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, starting with, I don't know that anybody is willing to give up some of their own speech in order to prohibit somebody else's. Usually,
well, I think it's when you were talking about giving up, you know, sort of, not giving up their own speech, but being willing to put limits on speech, right? To, you know, to control hate speech. So where would those limits be, is I think what he's trying to ask. I'm sorry if I'm not being 100% clear.
We were talking about sort of social norms, or and that has limited people from, hopefully because they don't believe they should be using the N-word, but there are certain things we know are allowable or not. And I mean, personally, you know, I wouldn't want to put any limits on free speech beyond what is been deemed illegal or actually harmful. I mean, I think at the Globe, we sometimes limit our speech, but it's from our own sense of what, I think you're right, words are very powerful, and we are always weighing the public's right to know against the harm inflicted, and I think there can be internally some limits we would put on what we have to say, but I would fight to the death to say we have the right to say it. I mean, there's a principle involved, and then there's also what is our ethical responsibility, and so I'm sort of an absolutist on this, and
As am I.
I think these guys are.
Yeah,
Maybe
I like the expression, what is it? I don't believe a word you're saying, but I defend you to my death the right to say it.
maybe it's worth also pointing out that the First Amendment governs public discourse, not private speech, and not speech in arguably in the places where most of us spend most of our time, namely workplaces and schools. In the United States, there are, as Carol mentioned a bit before, under a different branch of law, there are quite extensive restrictions on speech in workplaces. For example, at the university where I teach, I have to do an anti-harassment, anti-workplace discrimination training every semester. And once I remember that it instructed me not to bring those black balloons to somebody's 50th birthday party, In other words, some of our restrictions in specific places like workplaces and schools, also including campus speech codes in the United States, some of those rules would be flabbergasting to Europeans, for example, who are, on the other hand, flabbergasted by our First Amendment. They think of, our First Amendment as this kind of crazy cowboy, Wild West cowboy movie madness. But then if you tell them about the relatively restrictive codes on campuses and in workplaces in the United States, they're surprised in the other direction. So we live under a kind of peculiar variety of rules regarding speech, some of which are outliers in one direction and some are outliers in the other direction compared with most countries. So I guess in response to the question, I would say that we already do draw the line in much more restrictive places regarding specific places where we spend time.
Time is short. Our ambitions tremendous. Please.
Oh, hi. My name is Caroline, and I would like to be a little more positive about everything else what I have here at this moment. The fact is that I come in very frequently to all these meetings here in John F. Kennedy, and I enjoy very much the fact that I see so many people here, many seniors, very young, many people from school, and everyone is coming, and they can stand up and say something. At this moment, I would like to take advantage of my First Amendment, and I would like to ask you, any one of you, gentlemen and ladies, do you think that someday we are going to be able to have more women in Washington? Because the men in Washington are a disgrace. What a failure. What a failure. What a big failure. And I also would like to know if we are going to be able to have a woman as a president. It's not that because I am a woman or because I hate men or anything else, but the fact is that we have more common sense, we have better communication, And, the only thing that I have left at this point to say is that I have to keep praying for another 3 years and a half or more, because whatever the things are going in Washington, oh Lord, is just to pray, beginning with our interesting president, and amen. So I would like just to thank you and everyone who is here for being here today.
Thank you.
I'm glad you got your chance to express your your feelings.
Thanks. I just had a question about anonymous speech and whether anonymous speech in the public discourse is either normatively protected or in fact protected by law. And is that an edge that we just haven't explored on this session so far?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's a really great question. It's really troubling, especially in the age of internet speech where people get trolled and bullied and things like that with anonymous speech. But it is protected. And the reason that it's protected actually comes from a case, NAACP case, where during the civil rights movement, there was an effort by Southern white officials to force the NAACP to turn over their membership lists, because then they wanted to target people who are supporters or members of the NAACP and to terrorize them effectively and to try to silence them. And the court ruled that the importance of the ability to dissent and to criticize your government is tremendously important, that you have the right to remain anonymous in order to do that. And so that's the history of why anonymous speech has been protected, again, coming out of the civil rights movement. But I think that there are really challenging questions now, today, about whether that's going to hold up in the age of the internet, because people are so appalled, because when people can speak anonymously, they often say things that they wouldn't do because of the norms that are otherwise in place. But we have an interesting case here in Massachusetts. So during Occupy Boston, there was a person who published anonymously, John Doe, or Jane Doe, I don't really know, who published out of the phone book addresses of police officers, right? And so what happened is the prosecutors just went to Twitter and said, give us John Doe's identity. And interestingly, Twitter, unlike some of the other tech companies, actually contacted
Carol, I'm going to ask you to abbreviate your answer.
Contacted John Doe, and so we were able to go into court to try to challenge that effort to try to reveal his identity or her identity. What happened, interestingly, was the court initially declared that the entire case was sealed. The existence of the case was sealed. The ACLU briefs were sealed completely, in a completely secret hearing. It was really alarming for 10 years. So we are now in court trying to unseal our briefs that we wrote. So interesting stuff going on with anonymous speech, but the history of it goes back to the NAACP case.
Our last question.
All right. So I want to say thanks for having this. This is really good. But the question that I have is, it was mentioned that it's our right to raise up and defend free speech, but it was mentioned also when the Parkland survivors said that the people of color who are also victims of the Parkland shooting weren't heard and weren't listened to by the media. So my question is, do you believe that it is also the right of the people who actually have privilege to raise up and allow those who don't have privilege to be spoken for, to speak up and address these issues as well, especially when now people are paying attention to all the hate speech that's being on, because people like Trump and those of his supporters many times are using human whistles, whereas dog whistles, and the microaggressions that were done, the microaggressive actions weren't actually heard and people didn't pay attention to. So I guess my question is, what should we do to help people be heard when those microaggressions are being done, and how do we help raise up those people who aren't being listened to in mainstream society?
I think it's, I'll just speak, I think it's tremendously important. I was very pleased to see that the Parkland students here in Boston, on the Boston Common, were bringing in issues about, 56 so far this year? You know, mostly youth of color have been killed by handguns. So I think it's important that we use our speech to do two things. One is to raise those issues, microaggressions, the inequalities, the racism that persists in our society, but then also that, as you suggest, that we make space and we make room and we learn to step back so that people can raise their voice, and that we create the space and then step back and hold that space open and sacred so that all voices can be heard. Because I do think that freedom of speech is our queen in the chess match, and we need to use that to promote equality. It won't give us equality, but without free speech, we won't have equality.
Boy, I feel better. I was thinking maybe I'd leave here singing the blues, and I feel really optimistic.
Good.
So, Carol Rose, Jennifer Peter, and Susan Benesch, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.